power of choice and being selective, and how it led Bo Sandoval from equipment manager to his current role as strength and conditioning director at the UFC. Bo's take on work-life balance and more in this episode of the No Excuse to Miss podcast. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome back to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I'm your host, Scott Valkortson. This week's guest recently competed in the inaugural 6-hour Hunter Games. He is the director of strength and conditioning for the UFC. And above all else, he's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. I'd like to welcome to the show, Bo Sandoval. How are you doing, Bo?
Hey, Scott. I'm doing great this morning, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time. I know you are a busy man, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, always good to catch up.
Yes, it is. So, like I said, I know you're busy, so we'll kind of jump right into it. I guess the first thing is let's kind of start. How did you go from growing up in Louisiana? Take us a little bit back on how you ended up being the strength and conditioning director for the UFC.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all starts with the career path, right? So I've growing up in Louisiana, I played all kinds of sports as a kid. Going into college, it was one of those typical kids didn't know what they wanted to do and just kind of went to school without declaring a major, and I had an in-state scholarship at Northwestern State, Louisiana. Started up there, got introduced to the softball and baseball teams. I applied for an on-campus job, and they put me out there cutting grass. And while I was there, the head coaches kind of approached me and were like, hey, do you want to make some money? And I was like, sure. They're like, we need an equipment manager. We can pay for your school. And I said, well, my school's already paid for. And I said, well, we can give you an hourly wage. I'm like, all right, I'll take that. That's my weekend beer money. So took them up on that, got introduced to college athletics via doing laundry and taking care of fields and all that kind of stuff. And then started just kind of observing the teams going down into the weight room and asked the coaches if I could just tag along and see what they were doing. And lo and behold, down in that weight room, there was a strength and conditioning coach, and got to know those guys pretty well at the time. The guy's name was Thad Livingston. And I just asked him, like, you care if I'm just a fly on the wall and kind of just see what you do down here? And he had every team on campus coming through there. And so that was my exposure to strength and conditioning. From there, I ended up getting an opportunity to transfer to Southern Mississippi about a half a year later. That head softball coach took a head job down there. She needed an equipment manager, and she was like, hey, would you like to get the same deal down there? It's a little bigger school, little bigger program, and it's closer to your home. It was about an hour and 15 minutes closer than where I was at, which I wanted to be a little bit closer to home. Hattiesburg is also about 50 miles from about a 70-acre, 80-acre parcel of land that's been in my mother's family for over 100 years. So I knew that on the weekends I could get down there, I could hunt, fish, mess around down at the camp and have a good time. So that was kind of another incentive to take that offer. And I just told her, hey, when you get me down there, if you could get my foot in the door with the strength and conditioning staff, that would be much appreciated. So she already had a meeting set up for me by the time I got there, and I started interning with those guys right off Jump Street. And I interned all the way through my senior year of undergrad. Did a good enough job that those guys offered me a graduate assistantship in strength and conditioning. And I was pursuing a master's in exercise science. And so I did that for 2 years. Pretty much when you're a GA, it's pretty much full-time coaching, and then you're doing a little bit of school on the side. And then after that, I took my first job as a strength and conditioning coach at Belhaven College, which is a small NAIA school. They're a little bit bigger now. They're a Division III, maybe even Division II now, Belhaven University. It's in Jackson, Mississippi. That's where I cut my teeth, working with a lot of coaches that were older than me, working with a lot of coaches that were more experienced than me, and really started to kind of build my resume and my skill set. And then from there, got hired at the U.S. Olympic Committee. That's where I got introduced to combat sports. Came on as kind of a utility strength coach, helping with everybody. And then they quickly kind of stuck me in a portfolio that was all combat sports, freestyle wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, Taekwondo, judo, fencing. And then I worked with a few other sports just on the side. Standing free pistol, rifle, and shotgun were three that we had residents there that I got to spend quite a bit of time with. That's where I got introduced to shooting sports. And then From there, got an opportunity to be an assistant director at the University of Michigan to kind of help build up a program that had been neglected for a few years, at least from a strength and conditioning perspective. Spent the next 8 years there. I would say my time there was, I definitely got a lot more coaching experience, but that's where I got a lot more leadership experience. Mike Faber, who's the director there now, was my colleague at the OTC, and he was my boss at the University of Michigan, and really gave me a lot of opportunities to grow as a leader, manage a lot of people underneath me, really get to manage a bunch of different big caliber programs at the University of Michigan. And that really kind of set the table for me to have the skill set to apply for a position like the UFC role. So obviously they were looking for someone with combat sport experience, but also someone with a variety of sporting experience. And I would say the other kind of big one was someone that had been around weight cutting sports before, but they wanted an outside pair of eyes. They didn't necessarily want someone who was already in MMA. They wanted a fresh set of eyes to settle on the sport, that had an educated background that could help kind of shift and alter, if not improve, the way that fighters prepare for fighting. So over about the last, almost 20 years, that Southern Miss journey started around 2001. So about 20 years, and here we are.
And have I heard you say that when the job came up for the UFC, had you just built a house or were just planning to build a house in Michigan?
Yeah, I had that come to Jesus meeting with my wife. I had applied and aggressively competed for a job at NC State. I got offered that job. It was not the right fit, and so I turned it down. I applied aggressively for a Florida State job. I competed for that job, got offered that job, turned it down. My wife kind of pulled a, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" And I was like, "What?" She's like, "You're sending me on a roller coaster ride. Are we coming? Are we going? Are we leaving? Are we staying? What are we doing?" And we had built our first home in Ann Arbor in 2010. And we had already had our first son. We were planning to have more. So we're kind of outgrowing our little house we built. And so that was the ultimatum, was like, are we moving or are we getting out of town? Or Michigan takes really good care of us. Awesome benefits. It was a great place to work. Awesome team. And it given me a lot of room for growth while I was there. And so we kind of just made the decision, like, all right, they take good care of it. We're staying here. Let's find what we want. So we found a 3-acre parcel of land right outside of town in Dexter, Michigan, started building our dream home on it. And about halfway through it, I got a letter from a third-party recruiter saying, "Hey, the UFC is onto a new project. We're recruiting people for this director of strength and conditioning role. Your name came up through the wrestling and combat sports ranks, and we want to talk to you about it." So after some deliberating, I honestly passed the email over to Amanda and was like, "Hey, you tell me if you want me to call them back. If not, then I'm good." And about a week went by. At the time, I was dealing with the passing of my father. We had to go down south and handle all of his affairs. And by the time we got back home, she was kind of like, "Hey, I think you should at least call them and see what they have to say." And then 5 months later, we were in Las Vegas.
And what year was this that you guys ended up moving?
2017.
Okay. So, and I've been fortunate. You guys were gracious enough to let us tour the UFC PI, which is, I know you guys are already renovating it and updating it, but from what I saw, it was an amazing facility with, all the technology that you guys have. One question I had, and I didn't get to ask you out there, is how does it work? Like, I know a lot of the fighters have, their teams, their coaches, their trainers, their camps. When you may think there's a better way, or the data collection that you have from working with so many fighters has proven or shown there's a better way. How does that work from a mental standpoint, dealing with these fighters when they have a camp that might be telling them something else?
Sure. That's actually one of our responsibilities and one of the things that we're tasked with. So we're a central resource embedded in the middle of the biggest fighting league in the world. And so not only do we take on fighters in a more intimate role where we're designing and building a structure around their training to fit in with their MMA philosophy and their coaches here locally. But we're tasked with doing that remotely as well, sometimes very directly, and then sometimes as a liaison that's just assisting their already established performance team. So we wear many different hats in terms of how we deliver those resources. Sometimes I'm just a suggestion box, and sometimes I'm more of a director who's saying, okay, this is the route we're going. And sometimes I'm kind of the deciding factor that helps. Maybe they're already at a split in the road and they're trying to figure out the best route to go down. And then I can provide a little bit of evidence or a little bit of data or feedback on what they're currently doing to help kind of direct that final decision. So we deliver it a variety of different ways, but in terms of the difficult conversations that you're referring to, good old fashioned people skills doesn't hurt. You have to understand and respect that a lot of these individuals have a ton of great experience. If there's anything that we have to offer is we have a little bit deeper insight because we get to look at every fight camp, not just the few that are coming through one in particular gym. And that's powerful in terms of giving options for informed decision-making when someone's getting ready for their next bout. So that's how we do it. That's the responsibility that we're tasked with. And it's different for everyone. But ultimately our job is to help them. So we're really kind of philosophically set up to build more bridges than we burn. So that's just part of the balance. And I've always kind of, with any coaching responsibility I've ever had, it's always been, we'll try to influence, and sometimes our influences will be in big leaps. Other times we might have to take one step back to take two steps forward later on. It's just kind of like marriage, you pick and choose your battles, and you're building integrity in that relationship as time goes on. So philosophically, that's how we're set up, and that's how our entire performance team is geared to integrate with all of these different fight teams globally.
Because I would imagine there's a lot of ego and pride that could potentially get in the way when you're dealing with guys that have been in the game for a long time.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, there's also has to be some empathy and some delicacy from a world-class practitioner on how they deliver those messages. Obviously, that person's there for a reason. They're probably pretty damn good at fighting. They probably know a great deal more about fighting than what we know. So we got to make sure when it comes time to open our mouth that what we're delivering is something that's going to be influential over the camp. If it's not even worth saying, just to give them my opinion on how to fight. And usually when we talk about like how we influence someone's camp, for me personally, a lot of those conversations will revolve around efficient use of energy, meaning boiling down to their structure and their schedule. Sometimes it's not that they have the wrong practices or wrong ingredients or wrong whatever in there. It's just that they're jumbled up in a way that they don't make sense. So they eliminate all of their recovery opportunities. So a lot of my conversations are around just negotiating, shifting the schedule around to open up greater windows of recovery so they can actually adapt from their training. They're great fighters. Are outstanding at delivering stimulus. They're very good at it. They're very good. They can get stimulus all day long, but there's no adaptation until you've recovered from that stimulus. So a lot of our conversations will typically revolve around diet, sleep habits, and then building that schedule in a fashion that opens up windows of recoverability. And so, when you're having those kind of conversations, it's not like I'm getting into the tactics like, hey man, you're throwing your jab wrong, or, hey, too many spinning attacks. Don't do that. You're setting yourself up for failure. That's not really my role. They have technical coaches to address that. But I can have an influence on saying, hey, you got 4 hours straight of practice on a Thursday that ends at 1 p.m. And then you start practice again at 9 a.m. on Friday with another hard wrestling practice. So really kind of taking that 4-hour chunk on the day before, splitting it up where there's more adequate recovery time in between. And then maybe even the next day, pushing that 9 a.m. practice back to 1 p.m. So you've got a bigger window of recoverability before you roll into that next that next little torture sesh on the mats. So those are usually what the conversations sound like. It's more strategy and shifting things around. I always tell people we're kind of like a sous chef. We're not the main chef. We're like a sous chef where you've got all the right ingredients and you got everything to make it taste good. We're kind of adapting the order of events and what the temperature control is and how long we're smoking that thing. That's kind of what our role is in influencing a camp.
And is the PI available to anybody that's currently under contract with the UFC?
Anyone that's on our roster, they have full access to us remotely, locally. We feed fighters remotely. We have food programs set up for meal delivery globally. We set them up with Oura rings. So there's lots of streams for data exchange on top of sort of a 24-hour call line, if you will, of reaching out to any of our staff at any time.
And I'd have to imagine that's invaluable because I know, like, just for me, I'll wear an Oura ring when I sleep. And obviously I'm not pushing myself to the level that these guys are. But it's amazing how you can find like very simple things. Did I have a couple drinks last night? Did I eat more dinner?
Yeah.
How it'll like affect your sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that when you start wearing a monitoring system like that, it definitely opens up your eyes at just how fine-tuned you can dial yourself in, but also how easy it is to throw yourself out of whack with just a little too much sugar too close to bedtime.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it really helps us kind of nail down where the drag factors are so that we can improve what's going on. Recovery is so, especially when you're looking to try to like optimize your potential. A lot of people think strength and conditioning, it's always just enhance performance. Well, a lot of times we're just trying to use the performance that we have, just actually utilize what they're currently capable of. And you can't do that without optimum recovery. So like you can train your ass off, but if you're not recovered, you never even get to spend that on the day. It's like having a big ass savings account, but you don't have access to it. So you don't get to spend the cash. And that's what we're constantly having conversations around and I always ask the question when fighters come in, how many times have you stepped inside the cage on fight day and said, I feel 100%, physically 100%. And a lot of times that's not the case. Not only are they dealing with just recovering from the rigors of day-to-day training, but the weight cut piece. So if you don't have your ducks in a row just to recover from the day-to-day rigors of training, you're definitely not going to stand much of a chance at getting back to 100% after cutting anywhere from 12 to 24% of your body mass in a 24-hour time period.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to then go out and perform at, the biggest stage, not being at 100%.
Yeah, I mean, mentally, it's one of the most incredible feats that I've ever witnessed. And we've seen some that are literally knocking on death's door, trying to cut the weight and turn around. And you look at the performance, and the performance is just unbelievable and outstanding. And you just can't figure out and wrap your head around how they pull that off. It's like the most mental overcoming of anything. I mean, it's impressive. It's not optimal by any means, but it's impressive how some of them can do it.
Speaks a lot for what mental fortitude can do.
Totally.
Shifting gears a little bit, the one thing I've noticed is it seems like the UFC over the last, even like before the pandemic, had been steadily climbing, gaining viewership, gaining ratings, compared to like a lot of the other pro sports that have either gone flat or possibly even declined a little bit. Do you attribute a lot of that just to how like Dana runs the entire company? Or, I know, and I don't want to get overly political on it, but I know, he has, or the entire company's kind of stayed away from a lot of what has brought down other pro sports, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things I'd say about our entire leadership team, our executive team, is they try to keep just everything focused on fighting. So even when you listen to interviews and things, you don't see them get too far outside the scope of fighting. You don't see them get too far into the scope of like people's belief structures and, certain decisions they're making outside of fight. Everything, if it doesn't have anything to do with fighting, they typically don't talk about it. And
which
that's just
for me as a fan, that's what I want to see.
Right.
That's why I tune into sports, is to kind of escape reality.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the main reasons I don't watch ESPN anymore. I mean, half of the reporting and half of the conversation has more to do with stuff outside the sport and little to nothing to do with the actual sport. And we have so many platforms. If you want to dive into political views or religious views or whatever, there's so many other platforms to do that. Why are we using the sports platform to do that? Now, I understand the sports platform can be a catalyst for leadership and growth and things like that. But when you're talking about big professional sports in the mainstream, just televise the sport. Just show me who's playing, what the score was, what the competitive advantages were. Show me the swings in the game back and forth. Other than that, I don't care what their political views were or what they got in trouble doing offside, whatever. I don't need to know that. The regular news can report that.
Absolutely. And I think,
they're just the same that every other, any sort of media source. It's an attention grab. And if they can grab 5 more minutes of your attention, that's what they're going to try to do.
Because I've talked to a lot of people, friends, customers, whatever, that right now about the only pro sport that they do watch is like the UFC. And I think it's probably a lot for those reasons.
Yeah. The other thing is that I think there's been a lot more shift in understanding and appreciating what it's like to truly compete one-on-one in a very brutal sport that is that unforgiving. I mean, there's a lot on the line. You're on the ledge back and forth, whether you're winning the thing or losing the thing, and anything could happen at any given moment. Momentum can shift so quickly compared to some other sports. So, I mean, that's an exciting factor of it and why you kind of can't take your eyes off of it once you have it on. But I think also, part of the growth has been just better exposure. I mean, the UFC progressively over the years, over the decades, has put themselves in position to get just a little bit more visibility on different media platforms. And that has continued to grow up until this point now. And so they've tried to stay, in the hustle when things went to big networks. They tried to stay in the hustle when things went to pay-per-view. They try to stay in the hustle when things are going to streaming. They've never kind of waited back to see how things are going to grow. And as soon as they saw a niche or something that was opening up, something new, they found a way to get their foot in the door.
And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be taken from there, even like for me, for business, of the way they approach everything, the way the leadership treats their employees, their fighters, everything seems to be done the right way.
It's one of those companies. It's a big machine. I mean, this machine, if I fell off tomorrow, this machine would keep on rolling. There'll be someone else that they can get in there. They'll do a great job. But they've got that set up that way from the ground level. I mean, all the way to the top. They've got the ability, they've got depth, they've got vision, and they've got it in so many different departments that some aspect of the company is growing at all times. And that's pretty inspiring to be around because we're just a small, Performance Institute is just a tiny, tiny little speck of what the UFC is. I mean, if you look in terms of our production team, our marketing teams, our partnership teams, our legal team. I mean, they're massive and they're extremely capable. So it's inspiring to be around that kind of capability and that kind of forward thinking. And you're right, there are tons of opportunities that they give us for growth and development. Regardless of your department, there's always avenues of professional development within the company. So you're not only pushing to try to drive the brand in a better direction with your little piece that you're contributing, but knowing that you've also got opportunities to drive your own brand, drive your own resume and your own professional development within that machine.
Well, and something else that stood out to me when we were talking when I was out in Vegas is, you guys have the PI over in Shanghai. And you mentioned that you're on the phone to them almost, I believe you said every day. You could correct me if I'm wrong on that. So I start asking, how do you, is your job like a 24/7 thing when you're dealing with the time zone differences and everything?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not on the phone with them every day. That'd be nice. It is usually a couple times a week. And I would say someone from our team is definitely in communication with someone from that team every day. And so we're at the point now where that's a pretty self-sustaining unit that we have there.
Okay.
They're kind of feeding data and information to us. We're feeding data information to them. The makeup and structure there looks a little bit different because that's a developmental academy. We do have a few rostered fighters that train on that side of the world out there, but a lot of that population they're dealing with is our developmental academy who are trying to debut into the UFC. So the structure is a little different, but yeah, that's part of it. And then I would say even more so is the liaisoning across the hundreds and hundreds of fight teams globally. I mean, email exchanges, WeChat exchanges, WhatsApp exchanges, telephone exchanges, back and forth from Eastern Bloc countries, South American countries, Canadians, you name it. I mean, all over the U.S. It's nonstop. I typically start sending text messages back and forth, usually somewhere between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Some of those are current. Some of those I'm answering stuff from 11 p.m. the night before. They know if they hit me after usually 10:30, they're not going to get an answer from me until the next morning. I'm usually out by then.
But it seems like
that's just part of the deal. But it's also, as a coach and a practitioner, it's what kind of keeps the fire lit. There's never a dull moment. There's never a repeated case. There's kind of a uniqueness to every case that we deal with. Whereas when I was working in college athletics, it was fun, but like you knew what to expect from every basketball season. Preseason starts at this time. Regular season starts at this time. Conference play starts at this time. Here's your conference tournament. If you do well at that, here's where the national tournament begins, and blah, blah, blah. And it's the same every year. You can almost mark the dates on my calendar 4 years from now. Whereas with this animal, I mean, we put on 46, 47 events per year. It really doesn't stop. And the matchups are always dynamic and changing. There's new blood coming in. Some guys are going out. It's just, there's never a dull moment. There's never a dull situation. So there's been a lot, because it's such a rapidly growing thing and a lot of development in the sport still. And it's exciting every week.
Well, and I don't think people realize probably how much time it takes you guys to put on an event that often. Not just an event, but like a big pay-per-view event multiple times a month.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why our production teams, man, they're incredible. First, they're an army. They're one of the biggest teams on the entire UFC employment line, but their capabilities, they just recently, so that the original construction of the Apex building it's a production facility. It's a world-class production facility. They can produce all of our pay-per-view, all of our it doesn't matter where that show is taking place, any continent in the world. They produce it all right there from that building. So they don't drive trucks anymore. They don't send production trucks like they did back in the old days. Everything is done remotely via that. The Apex is like a spaceship to me. It's kind of like the mothership, and it handles all of that. They have multiple green rooms in there. All the interviews take place in there. They're working on, there's podcast studios in there, interviewing studios. You guys got to see, Dana's got a private suite in there that he entertains guests with. When we have local events in that facility, there's a big enough room in there for a small arena, which we've hosted a lot of events in there throughout COVID. But it's an amazing production facility. And that was kind of a forethought from our production teams, like, hey, if we're going to up our game and our capabilities, we need this world-class production facility. And the technology that is in that place from a production standpoint, it blows my mind. I'm not privy to that world, so I'm probably pretty easily entertained. But even some that are in that world that we've taken through there, they're like, you guys have this on site? What? This is amazing. This is what the whole strip of Hollywood kind of wishes they had. So it's pretty amazing, their capabilities and what they do. But that's when you look at the response time and how quickly they get those productions up, and then the vastness, just the repetitiveness of one pay-per-view after another, one fight night after another, 46, 47 weeks out of the year. It's because they're well equipped and they're forward thinking and they're always ready.
And I think it goes back to what you said earlier is, the whole forward thinking, being ready, taking advantage of, putting your foot in that door as soon as it opens. they didn't wait for a pandemic to hit where they might have to use that Apex Center. They had built that, obviously for other reasons, but were able to shift and adapt probably quicker than anybody else on that level.
Sure. Yeah, that goes to just the natural aggressive nature of Dana White. I mean, I'm sure there's some other initiative amongst our team that's right there in line, but as soon as he says go, man, he's got an army of generals that are just ready to go. It's a community effort. But as soon as COVID hit, I mean, he called all 250 employees into the cafe, dialed in all the remote employees from remote offices around the globe, and pretty much was like, hey man, fuck this pandemic. We're not stopping. We're going to continue to grow. We'll find a way to put on our shows. We'll find a way to keep our fighters employed. We're going to make sure we keep all of you guys employed. No one's getting furloughed. No one's getting laid off. On the UFC side of things, that was absolutely true. None of that ever transpired. Endeavor, our mother company, they made some cuts and some furloughs and things. But as far as the UFC goes, Dana White kind of put his arms around us and kind of pushed us across the finish line throughout this whole pandemic thing. And kind of like you said, we had already taken over from a media standpoint. We had already taken over ice hockey in terms of the fourth largest televised and viewed sport. And then that just continued to gain momentum once the pandemic hit, because eventually we were the only sport that was being televised at the time. And so when you can't watch if it's during football season, you're used to every football Sunday watching the NFL, and it's not there anymore. It's like, what am I going to do? And so it not only satisfied our normal viewership, but definitely expanded our viewership quite a bit. There were new viewers that never watched MMA. What is this? Oh, it's on ESPN now. I'll check that out because nothing else is on. Then it was like, wow, this is pretty exciting sport to watch. Not to mention the first few events we put on in the pandemic, it was like knockout crazy. From the prelims to the main events, it was one knockout after another. And so I think that grabbed a hold of the attention. They're like, this is what it's like all the time, even though it's not. But there were so many hungry fighters at the time that were ready to go. We saw some outstanding performances.
Yeah, like you said earlier, just the idea that knockout can take place at any given time. You have to stay tuned for the entire fight. You can't walk away. And something else that I picked up on when I was out there, and this goes back to a credit to how Dana runs the entire company, is it didn't matter if we were carrying on in conversation with the security guards that were in that suite with us, or whoever you talked to in that entire operation, they all spoke very highly of what it's like to work for a company like that had your back through the pandemic, which to me was very inspiring as a business owner of, these guys are on a much higher, much bigger level than us. But the security guard I talked to said, every day when Dana walks through, he calls him by his first name. He's like, he's just a regular guy as he walks by.
Yep.
Which was pretty
cool. That's a big deal.
Yes, it is. So I want to jump outside the UFC for a second, because the other thing that I've noticed from following you on Instagram and meeting your wife is that how important like your family time outside of the PI, outside of the UFC world is to you. How do you balance being that busy and still making them a priority and have the energy to do that?
Yeah, it starts with your self-beliefs and your priorities. I get this question a lot, and maybe the perception is I've got it all figured out, but I definitely don't. It's the balance thing. I've always approached it as work-life balance is impossible, but I'm going to fight for it every day. That's the philosophy. And I think that also begins with when you're looking at employment, family's first. It happens first. It should always be prioritized first. It happens typically before the employment. At least for me in this situation did. And so I'm up front right off the jump. When it's time to interview, I make sure they understand right away how important that aspect of my life is. It's not going to be trumped. It's not going to be forgotten about and won't be pushed to the side. And when you kind of lay that foundation, your primary supervisors, they understand it. Your secondary supervisors get a whiff of it. Everyone up the chain understands like, hey, that's really important to him. It's the same thing like anything else. I do side projects and things like that. I always make sure when someone wants me to contract me out to do some work on the side or something, it's pricey. And when they ask me why, I'm like, because you're paying for my personal time. You're paying for my personal time that's going to take away from my family. And that's expensive. And I'm the one that gets to put the value on that. And I'm going to put it extremely high. And so I've always just kind of put that at the forefront. When I started to get a sense of independence in coaching, as I was working my way up the chain, I started to get an awareness and an understanding on where I could make room for my family. And I think that's important as you go through your progression as a professional and you're working your way up the ladder. If you're aware, you're constantly finding openings of where you can fit your family in, and you're finding opportunities on where you can notch a spot in there for your family to sit high up on the priority list. So for me, I've kind of done it since the foundation. And so that makes it easier. If you let years upon years stack up and go by and you haven't prioritized your family, and then all of a sudden your light bulb kicks on and you try to go to your boss, or you try to go to your employer and say, hey, this is really important to me. We need to restructure how I work. That's like a turd in a punch bowl. That's not a progressive approach to how you kind of implement that. So it's got to be part of your framework right from the jump with anything that you start, if that's truly that important to you. You know, there's some people intentionally, they don't have kids. That's not a driving force in their life. They don't have, those ties. They may not have much family. For us, it's extremely important, and it's always going to be a priority.
Well, and that's what, I see you with your kids, practicing BJJ. See you guys recently, you were out on a farm, I think down in Louisiana, doing some shooting. Spending that quality time, with your sons, with your wife, which I always find inspiring, because I'm like, if he can do it as busy as he is, I can do it.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's again, if it's a priority, you'll find, even if it's 10 minutes, you'll find it. It might be 10 less minutes that you get to sit down and take a breath, but at the end of the day, you can ask yourself how worth it was it. So
one thing I've learned is as I've gotten older is, if I spend 10 to 15 minutes with my kids, that's all they really want, and they're good. Much more than that, and they're like, okay, I'm going to go do something else anyway.
Yep.
So
I think in life, my fulfillment, if my kids are in their upper 20s or early 30s, and they're calling me on their own, unprompted, and they're asking me for advice, and they're asking me for favors, and they're asking me to catch up on, for dinner or whatever. I feel like if I can get to that point and have that happen, then I've won. But if we get to that point and my kids don't really want to have anything to do with me, and they're not reaching out, and they don't really want to catch up unless they're prompted and that kind of stuff, I feel like I've missed it. Like I will have missed the boat. So, I'm instilling what my value is in them right now. And that I'm going to continue trying to do that.
Well, it appears from the outside and from what I know that you're doing an excellent job at it. So kudos to you on that.
I'll say, and this better than anyone, the other caveat to that is a teammate. So
yes.
When you have an awesome counterpart, an awesome spouse, I mean, that contributes and believes in that same type of structure, it definitely helps. It makes it easier. It helps toe the line per se, because it takes a lot of hustle to be able to be a dual household income. Everybody's working plus spending time with your family. That's a team effort. So, that's the other sort of magical ingredient that makes this thing work.
Yeah. And it takes an understanding spouse to know at certain times, to get to where you're at in your career, that there's going to be might be a short time period that work is going to take precedence, or a project's going on that you have to devote all your time and energy to that. So it takes a very understanding person to be like, okay, you go do that now. I have things at home. That's
a terrific point. I mean, it is give and take 100%. When I first met my wife, she was the number 150, or at the time when I first met her, she was the number 2 ranked 58 kilo weightlifter in the country. When by the second year we were together, she was the number 1 58 kilo lifter in the country. She went on to win a few national championships in a row, made a couple of world teams, went to 3 different Olympic trials. our whole life revolved around traveling to let her compete while I was working in between. And, everything was set up for that. Later on, once she retired and kind of got into her nursing career and my career started to take off, the tides kind of turned a little bit, and we never discussed it. We didn't have a conversation about it. Automatically, she kind of jumped into support mode while I kind of jumped into the front seat a little bit. And so we just traded off. And then by the time you have kids and you have all these other variables in the mix, you've both learned how to work and support each other. It just makes it that much easier when there's some days I'm in the lead and there's some days when I'm in the back seat, and same thing with her. So, but that's a tremendous point. It's a give and take back and forth throughout your lifetime.
Yeah. And like you said, it's a team. It's not just one person doing it on their own. Another question, once again, shifting gears a little bit. I know that, we've met through Winter Strong, and I don't think I've ever asked you, where did you said your shooting or your interest in shooting started when you were at the Olympic Training Center, or did you hunt and shoot long before that?
Yeah. So, since I was a little kid, I was always around it. My dad was a tournament bass fisherman. He was a recreational whitetail hunter himself. Back in the 70s and even into the late 60s when my dad was growing up, they did it for food. That was, other than going and buying meat at the market, they got majority of their meat from the wild, small game and big game. On my mother's side of the family, they're all farmers that immigrated in from Scotland, came through the Port of New York, straight down south, and then stuck a stake in the ground about 50 miles off the coast of Biloxi, Mississippi, and back and forth from farming and raising cattle and livestock to fresh crops and vegetables and things, just depended on what the years offered them. But so when I was a kid growing up, when you're 5 or 6, you learn how to shoot a shotgun, and you learn like safety around knives and sharp weapons and how to skin out an animal and, how to take care of meat and all that. That was just part of it. So I was always around it. When I got into school and things, I wasn't around it as much because you're spending all your time in school. But I always said when I got the opportunity when I was working that I would try to get back into it. Now, when I got to the Olympic Training Center is where I got exposed to competitive shooting. I had seen it. I'd watched it in the Olympics. I'd seen it a little bit here and there on TV with exhibitions. Growing up, reading stories about Annie Oakley and personalities like that. But to be around that, where we had a pipeline from, kids that were from 14 years old up to, we had some that were enrolled in some of our military programs that were in their 30s and 40s, and the precision and the repetitiveness of their actions was something that I just hadn't seen in a lot of sports, other than maybe like a kicker in football or a 3-step drop in a quarterback, something like that, maybe a free throw, people got their routines when they get to the free throw line, but other than that, I hadn't really seen that type of repetition. When you see someone do standing free pistol and you look at their position and how they draw their arm up, line their sights up hundreds of times a day, and then 50 times in a match, it's like, wow, it's almost like a robot. It's like on hydraulics. It was pretty crazy what the human body was capable of and how small that freaking tin ring is that they're trying to thump 50 out of 50 times in a match like that. And then the shotgunner is a whole nother ball of wax. We just had a little girl, Amber English, she was a young teenager when I worked with her at the OTC. She just won a gold medal in skeet at the Olympics 2 days
saw
ago.
That.
It's cool to see some of these kids grow up now, and it's a sport there's a lot of longevity in. So I just had a lot of appreciation for that. They were all in it for the long haul. But anyhow, so yeah, that was awesome to get around that. And then, firearms are something we've always been around. It's both fun and recreational, but they're awesome tools when it comes time to bring a little bit of meat home. So that's kind of always been just a part of our lives and my family, my mother. I've got a picture of my mother standing in her Sunday school dress. This was in the late 60s. She might have been 8 years old, something like that, with a rabbit-eared double-barrel side-by-side shotgun that's taller than her, and my grandfather standing next to her, and he's got his Bible in his hand. It's just a picture that you don't see stuff like that these days. But my mother can, everything that I've ever done with a firearm, she could do it 10 times better than I can. So it's just always been around it, and it's always been in our blood. So it probably will continue to be.
How much fun was the SIG Hunter Games that you competed in? Being able to combine like the fitness, the shooting, the entire thing.
That's an experience I will never forget. It was, someone who, I'm familiar with firearms and things like that, but someone who's never really been in a difficult shooting competition, both at the level of expectation of execution and just being around so many world-class shooters while you're doing it. I mean, I was in a world of exclamation points, just in awe everywhere I turned around. And I'll never forget it. One, it was the event was very well ran. It was badass from head to toe. It was hosted in a first class, sort of way. And you had every opportunity to execute, from the equipment to the staging. But man, you have to strategize, and you had to be fit, and you had to be on your A game from the time the first cannon went off to start the first stage until the thing finished. It was incredible.
And I would love to see them grow this into, and maybe you already know if they're going to try, but like into an annual or a couple times a year event.
Yeah, they're hell-bent on making it an annual event. Will it turn into more frequency? Who knows? But for sure, the annual thing, they're looking at trying to put it on in different regions, so you have different levels of challenges each time. This one took place in the Queens Mountains in Wyoming. Queen Mountain Ranch, I believe is what it's called. About 2 hours northeast of Salt Lake City, Utah. And it had altitude challenges. It got hot. There was rough terrain, not only where you were hiking in, but where you had to set up and stage your shots. Everyone's trying to get prone because a lot of the shots were over 300 yards. And so they're trying to get in the most solid position they can to get on target. And so you're laying in rocks, you're laying in riverbeds. Some of the shots were, 200 meters downhill. Some of them were 400 meters with a 12 mile an hour crosswind. I mean, there was all kinds of crap. It was not your average day at the gun range, that's for sure.
Well, I was just going to say, it's a whole nother element then too, because your heart's usually beating out of your chest. So you have to take that into account, trying to hit those long range shots.
Yeah.
Which is, obviously you guys are extremely fit, which probably helped, but
there were some teams that struggled on a couple of the stages, just because there was one stage in particular, I believe it was stage 5. It had, I don't know how long it was, roughly half a mile. I mean, it was straight uphill. It had to have been a 28%, 25% grade. It was damn near straight up. You got on 30 to 40 pounds of gear because you had to carry your rifle, your pack. We had our bino harness on. We were carrying a SIG P320 just for kind of show, but that was attached to your bino. So you got all this stuff. You're in your boots, you're in long pants because you got to wear rugged gear. You're out in the middle of the wilderness. So to keep thorns and prickers and bugs and shit off you just got to be geared up. And if you were not used to one for altitude, the thing started at 8,000 feet. By the end of the day, you're at 9,000 feet. And so the altitude, on top of if you're just not generally fit, there were people that struggled with it for sure. Some of the stages were a little more forgiving than that, but there were 10 stages in all. I'd say 7 of them were ready to challenge you for sure.
It looked like, from following along on social media and seeing what you guys have all posted, it just looked like an incredible event.
Super cool. I think they even have plans to better televise it in the future as well. They had several camera crews out there running around, chasing us down at different stages, getting snapshots. But I I think they have plans to get bigger production crews out there and televise the thing, but pretty amazing. Kudos to those guys. That was an incredible event.
Yeah, they do things right. That is for sure. So I know you're busy. Like I said earlier, you're home with a couple boys that don't feel very well. So I don't want to keep you too long, but I have one last question that I kind of like to ask all of our guests.
Yeah, shoot.
That the one thing I've always found that most people that have become successful, there's something in their life, like an event that happened at one time. Maybe at the time it didn't even seem like it was a good thing, but it sort of put them on the path that they're on now. Can you think back to or pinpoint like one event that, started you down the path that you're on now? Was it taking the job as like the equipment manager or the move to Las Vegas after you were right in the middle of building your house?
I tell you, there's a lot, but I'll give you two significant. One is how I was raised. My parents were incredible, divorced family, but I had two dads. My mother's always been an influential figure and just would not allow me to half-ass anything. I mean, she has beat me into submission many, many times, whether it be verbally or physically. My dad was awesome from afar. Always influential, but I got to see him several times a year and just always played a huge role in how I was brought up. And then my stepdad's been in my life since I was 4, and who's another incredible influence, who not only prioritized getting along very well with my real father, but also being just a great teammate with my mother and just giving me an awesome upbringing. So I had no disadvantages there. I know some people don't have the best scenario when it comes to growing up. I had nothing to complain about when it comes to how I was set up to be successful. Now, they didn't do it for me, but they put me in position to be successful. So that's number one. And then I would say the other thing is somewhere along, I don't know who all taught it to me. I think I got it from multiple directions, but just being selective and really using choice, which is why I respect our Constitution so much in terms of having choices and having the ability to choose. How I was raised and the coaches that influenced me and my parents and how they influenced me and the people I've surrounded myself with, they've taught me to be selective and to have choice. I think that's how I selected the positions and the roles that I did. I think that's how I learned to turn down the roles that I did and really learn to be selective, like I mentioned, about prioritizing my family and setting myself up to live kind of life the way I want to live it. Somewhere down the road, all of my influences kind of shifted me that way. And I'm that way to this day. I'm selective whether we go to the grocery store, or I'm trying to find someone to change oil in my truck. I appreciate the power of choice, and I try to employ it in everything that I do. So I would say those two big things. You mentioned choosing to take that role as an equipment manager and all those things. I think somewhere along the line, someone put it into my head, like, don't just take everything you're given, but use some criticism and think things out and really understand, how's that choice going to affect me? How is that going to push me forward or set me back? Somewhere that got hammered into me, and that's kind of how I've lived my life.
Well, and that's so powerful, because you mentioned earlier you could have taken the job at NC State or Florida State, which on the surface I would imagine as a strength and conditioning coach, especially like the Florida State job back then, had to look pretty good.
Those are highly coveted roles. So I did not take those lightly. Those are outstanding opportunities. It's just a matter of, is it the right one for you at that time?
And it seems to me like when you were talking earlier about, being the equipment manager and different things, that you always, and this probably came from your upbringing as well, but you were always willing to ask questions. And all the way along the way, you said, you would ask questions, you would learn from this coach or from that coach, which to me tells me a lot that you were able to set any sort of ego or pride aside and be like, I don't know, I'm going to go ask and find out.
And that's the key. When there's a difference between asking a question and questioning things. Those come off very different. And depending on who you're dealing with, one may be more appropriate over the other. So I always try to educate younger coaches that work for me or interns or whoever is asking me, know the difference in when it's time to question someone and when it's time to ask questions. There's a very different tone And there's a different dialect and a different conversation that will transpire based on what you're trying to find out.
Yeah, I think that would definitely elicit a different response depending which way you go.
Yeah.
So, well, once again, I appreciate you taking the time, Bo. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with what you're doing with the UFC, what you're doing, training, strength and conditioning, everything related to that?
Sure. I mean, we're in the process of rebuilding our UFC PI website right now. So you'll be able to take a deeper dive and a greater look into what we have going on there. My Instagram handle is bo.sandoval. And my Twitter handle is @OlyStrength, OLY Strength. Those are always good ones to DM me or message or follow along however you want. Me and my wife also have a private training business on the side where we work with the local community on strength and conditioning. It's called ABS Performance. We call it the Capable Human Project. It's just around something we started during COVID, around just giving people, general public, more capability with how they take care of themselves physically. It's not a booty boot camp class. It's not a 6-pack ab class. It's about being a stronger, more endured, capable human being. So we're pretty proud of that. The handle for that on IG is ABS-performance. So you can find us on there. But yeah, reach out. We're always willing to have conversations and answer questions.
Well, I encourage you guys to reach out. I know Bo does an excellent job at responding to as many messages as he can get to. And from what I've seen, simply you have a knowledge base that very few people can compare with. So once again, I appreciate it. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show, please make sure and let us know at podcast@volkortson.com or leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. We appreciate all the feedback, good or bad. And as always, thank you for listening.